We're back on Issues of Faith, talking with Jeannie Alexander, Reverend Jeannie Alexander, with no exceptions, former head chaplain at Riverbend, about prison reform and the faithful response to prison reform. And I asked right before we went to break about, there's so many people who say, yeah, that we need prison reform, but boy, I need to feel safe. And they want to feel safe. So when you start talking about prison reform, how do we reconcile that?
Right. I love your questions. These are great. So talking about being safe. This goes along with cheap political rhetoric, right? For example, California. Stanford did a very interesting study. They took over 900 individuals who had been convicted of homicide, who had life sentences and then were paroled, and followed them over a 15-year period of time. Over that 15-year period of time, they had less than a 1% recidivism rate, okay? 0% recidivism on murder. And the most common charge of that 1% rate was larceny. And then they had 10% that had a parole violation, okay? That is so unbelievably far below the average rate of recidivism, which varies from state to state. And so then you think, well, that's interesting, that's California. Bureau of Prison Statistics conducted another study of over 15 states with over 100,000 individuals who had been released, who had life sentences, who had been convicted of homicide. You see the exact same thing. At that point, they had less than a 2% rate of recidivism. The Tennessee Department of Corrections did a recidivism study back in 2007. And their own words in their own study was that the lowest rates of recidivism were those individuals who had been convicted of the personal crimes, the crimes to the body, which included homicide. So if what we're afraid of, are we going to be safe in our communities? Yes, because that's not where the highest rate of recidivism comes from if you're thinking about bodily safe. The interesting thing as well, if you're talking about safety, is look at the conditions of prisons. Look at the way they operate. I mean, what do we think is going to happen if you take an individual who's already broken in many ways? And that was the interesting thing about language, victim and offender. Almost every offender I've ever known was a victim before they were ever an offender. And so you take someone who is often broken in multiple ways, who comes from an environment full of challenges, who may or may not be suffering from severe and persistent mental illness, put them in a prison context where you may lock them down in solitary confinement for who knows how many years. I mean, I've known individuals in the prison who are on solitary confinement for over 10 years. Put them in an environment that deprives them of normal human contact, that doesn't challenge them intellectually, that doesn't truly give them options for growing. And what are you going to get after 20 years, So that argument is that we make ourselves less safe by putting people in prison for some period of time because they come out less able to function. Right, exactly. And okay, so I understand the argument, and I've had this discussion with people before. Why should I educate a prisoner, right? I have student loans, my child had to take out student loans, this isn't fair, and you want to give prisoners college educations, for example? The answer is yes, because if we're making rational decisions and not emotional decisions, the rational decision is to educate. The rational decision is a therapeutic environment that's truly therapeutic, not just a name only so you can get federal funding. Because one of the things we know is that one college course completed by a prisoner reduces their possibility of recidivism by 40%.
But when we start working in this realm,
yes,
it becomes emotional.
Oh.
And when you hear from the family of a victim who we all have sympathy for, and terrible things have happened, then it becomes very difficult to move in this direction. So how should we get past that? How do we get past that? You've dealt with that. I mean, what do we do? Right, absolutely. And it's not the case that a person who is for radical prison reform is not also pro-victim. I think the answer to that is that retributive justice has done absolutely nothing to heal victims. Again, this is something we don't have to try to figure out or make up on our own. There are models that we can look to. There are examples. There are good statistics. There's good data on this now. Retribution destroys, all right? Restoration heals, right? And so when I talked about
doing the tough systemic work earlier. I'm talking about working with all stakeholders with regards to crime. I'm talking about working in the communities. I'm talking about stopping the cradle to prison pipeline. Again, because it's so complicated with victim and offender. I've got so many people that I love and who are dear to me, and the reality of their lives is that they have been offenders, they've committed crimes, they've also been victims, they've also lost family members. It's just not so neat and tidy, but what I do know is that we have to work to heal communities.
And churches can play a role, right?
Churches have such an important role.
It seems like what churches have done up to now is they will get a group together and they will go and visit people in prison.
Right.
And that's powerful. Some churches help people once they get out of prison, get reinstated into the community. That's very powerful. What are you saying now, though? There needs to be something even more.
What I'm saying is that the churches who have the most profound experiences, who have a prison ministry that's active, are the churches who go in not with the mentality, we're going to go into this prison and save you poor, dirty sinners because clearly you wouldn't be in here if you knew anything about God. The most successful models are the churches who go in with an open heart and an open mind and understand that prisoners are not projects. Okay, prisoners are their brothers and their sisters behind the wall, and those church members go in, the body of Christ walks in that door ready to be transformed, and that absolutely happens when they're open to it. It is transformative, and then they're able to see through a lens of justice, and not just the lens of mercy, and not just the lens of wanting to do something for. Then they start to wake up and understand what the gospel absolutely preaches, and that is a gospel of liberation. That is a gospel of freedom. It's not a gospel of fear, you know. And if that gospel is good news, it has to be good news to everyone. And so we're called to be in relationship with the other. We're called to see beyond so that we don't see someone as the other. We're called to be able to look with the eyes of God to see that divine spark in everyone, regardless of their circumstances and where they are. And when that happens, when you begin to transform, then you realize that this is not what God wills for our world. This is not what the kingdom of God looks like, warehousing over 28,000 people in the state of Tennessee. And you're called to do the hard work. You're called to not be complicit in a system that destroys humanity, that breaks people, that destroys communities and families, but instead to restore. Because you know what? Prison is a pro-life issue. You know,
so that means getting involved on the front end.
It absolutely means getting involved.
It means trying to change a system that is well entrenched.
Yes.
But that has the United States as the highest country in the world as far as the number of people incarcerated.
Absolutely. So how can we possibly be and not that I agree that we are, but how could we possibly be any semblance of a Christian nation? How could we possibly follow this Nazarene who preached radical, scandalous love and incarcerate, have 25% of the world's prisoners and incarcerate at the level that we do? We simply can't, right? So then how do you do the works of justice? So what does the church do? The church is a place of great resources, human resources. I mean, let's just be realistic. The church is the body politic also. You know, laws are human constructs, are human creations. And the church is invested in what the society looks like. It should be invested in that. We have the ability to change laws. We have the ability to make rational, good choices for our communities. Can I give you one example?
Yes,
Let's
absolutely.
talk about reentry, okay? Because there are a lot of churches who are also interested in reentry as well. So when people come out from those walls, when they can end that exile and separation, and again, language is so curious. We're hearing a lot of talk about returning citizens. Returning citizens. I find that offensive. And I think most of the former prisoners I know who have now returned to society find that incredibly offensive too. And what I mean by that is, what do we think that citizenship means in a democracy, right? If we have any hope of being any sort of real, viable, living, growing, evolving democracy, something that is sustainable, that's got to mean something. So how is it you can be a citizen when you've been disenfranchised? You know, we have the mayoral election coming up, you know, and I had the opportunity at Jefferson Street Baptist Church a couple of weeks ago. There were a number of candidates there. And And one came up to a group that I was standing with and talked to us about the vote. And I said, you know, there are a lot of people standing in this room who I know would be happy to support you, but they've all been disenfranchised, and I'm afraid they can't vote. I mean, and that's just the reality, right? They can't serve on a jury. They can't live in certain locations. It's incredibly difficult to get a job. I mean, because on every application, it's the question, do you have a felony conviction? And so that's one thing that the church can do. I mean, take a step back and let's be realistic about reentry. How successful is that going to be? How do you convince someone that they are a citizen when you have now constructed a situation that will not allow someone to ever pay their debt to society? It's the big scarlet F.
And so that means changing, well, again, working politically.
You have
and
to.
changing the system, essentially.
Right.
And how, you became head chaplain at River Bend. How did that happen? How were you called to do that? And how has that informed or changed your opinion, all of those experiences there? You were there 3 years. Prior to that, you were a volunteer chaplain, right?
Yeah, for 2
so
years.
How did you get called to that, and how has that informed where you are now?
Right. How I got called to that was I had spent most of my adult life trying to not have a call to ministry. I was working as a corporate trial attorney in Dallas, Texas. I'd gone to law school in New York. I sort of moved around and engaged in a lot of pro bono work to try to get away from this gnawing sense of knowing this is not what you were supposed to be doing in the world. And finally, I could not resist that call. God is irresistible. I mean, and so I left the practice of law and went back to graduate school because you can always do that when you're not exactly sure where you're supposed to be going, for religious studies, and became deeply engaged in Christian ethics and became aware of the Catholic worker movement and the works of mercy and justice that were practiced, and was in Atlanta for a number of years, moved to Nashville. And I first became active in prison ministry actually in Georgia. The first prisoner I ever met was Troy Davis on Georgia's death row, which had an incredibly strong impact on me because I knew from that moment prison was not what I thought it was, and the people behind those walls were not who I thought they were. So moved to Nashville, got involved with the prison here, initially on death row. That was my original thought, is I would really focus on death row. Worked as a volunteer chaplain there for 2 years. Never considered taking a job as a state chaplain. You know, I have really strong beliefs that you don't serve Caesar, you're here to serve God, you know. If I could just say, like last night, I was at American Baptist College, and Bishop Flunder spoke, and she set the place on fire. And one of the things she said was that the gospel is not a gospel until it tracks a scandal and tears down an empire. Okay, and that's been my framework that I operate of. That's how radically I do view the gospel. And so I thought, well, I can't work for the state. And a couple of my guys on death row came to me after class one day and said, if you don't take this job and protect us, who will? I thought, well, this is going to be a miracle. I mean, people know me well enough around here. I have radical politics. But the warden at the time also knew I was very much about the business of trying to implement good programming, of trying to make change. And so that's how I was able to do that.
That's a fascinating journey. And now you founded, and you're the director of No Exceptions. Mm-hmm. We have 3 minutes here. What about that? What is No Exceptions?
No Exceptions Prison Collective absolutely comes out of my informed faith and the need for justice and not just mercy. And so at No Exceptions, we're focused on 3 primary areas of prison reform. One would be life sentences, the 51-year life sentences in the state. The other is health care in the prisons and the parole board, meaningful reform to the parole board. And we do that through a number of ways. We focus on, there'd be a focus on legislation, on litigation, but also organizing. You know, if there are 28,000 prisoners in this state, then by God, there are at least 70,000 people who care about what happens. But it's the loved ones of prisoners have for so long been a marginalized group themselves that just has not been able to organize, does not recognize that they have a voice, they have political power, and it matters what happens to the people that they love behind the walls. They don't have to be ashamed. They can hold their heads up, and they can say, we also want justice for our children. We want justice for our spouse. We want justice for our brothers and sisters. And so we're working to organize the families.
And that's a big mountain to climb to really change this system.
Right,
and
absolutely.
so how optimistic are you? I mean, where do you think we'll be in 5 years? And how critical is it that we that we get somewhere. But we have a minute left. And where do you think we'll be in 5 years?
I'm extremely optimistic. I'm realistic, and I'm also optimistic. And I think that in 5 years we will see change, we will see movement, because I think it is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The cost of this prison society that we've built is absolutely untenable. You know, if you don't care about the gospel, if you don't care about human rights, then you probably care about the bottom line. And that, quite frankly, is where we win. For those of us who care about prison reform, we understand that we haven't created a safer society. We understand that this is economically untenable. And we understand that as a democracy, as a country that purports to believe anything is sacred about freedom, our souls can't bear this, our collective political soul.
Well, a fascinating conversation. Jeannie Alexander, with no exceptions, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Very interesting. Thank you for joining Issues of Faith. Have a great day, everybody.